welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Turn the Page. I am your host today, Jen, and today I am joined by the author of an absolutely fascinating book that is extremely timely and also has a lot of really interesting history as well as a really interesting analysis of the present. And I am so excited. So welcome to the show. Could I please ask you to introduce yourself and your book, please?
Well, hi, my name is Tiffany Jenkins. My book is called Strangers and Intimates, The Rise and Fall of Private Life. And as you alluded to, there's a lot of discussion in the present about privacy. But I wanted to begin by looking at where it came from because it's not a natural thing. And by understanding its kind of origins, I thought we might be able to unpick also why it's both important and why it is under threat.
It is such an interesting discussion, and you link together contemporary issues with like a very long history. But before we get into all that, could you tell us a little bit about your career and your research generally?
Okay, well, I'm a PhD in sociology, but I'm most interested in looking at why things are the way they are by looking at history. Because I think sometimes if you go back in time, you can see things are both different and the same, and you can kind of isolated causes. You can kind of isolate causes in that way. In terms of my career, it's been what I might call a scenic route. So I have been a journalist as well as an academic before kind of situating myself in that kind of in-between sweet spot, I think. So this book should be scholarly but really accessible. It shouldn't read like an academic tome because it's not, but I did do a lot of work going back and looking at the history books and the archives and things like that.
Mm. Yeah, I am very interested in the sources that you look at because you do, go all the way back to ancient times. Did you look at a lot of primary sources from the time, read a lot of histories? What was your research process like for this book?
It was pretty eclectic. So I did read a lot of histories as well as looking at some archival material. So, for example, I got really interested in the 17th century. This is after the kind of the Reformation and the religious wars that were coursing through Europe. And I wanted to understand how they understood it, because, of course, it's very easy to kind of read things very much through the prism of the present. And that's why I did look at some of the archives. I looked at the archives around what were called the bawdy courts or the bum courts. These were church courts, and the cases that I look at were basically neighbours spying on other neighbours to see who went into each other's bedrooms and shouldn't have been, because this was a time when sex outside of marriage was outlawed. But what would happen would be that people would still do what they shouldn't do, and people could spy through keyholes to then take that evidence to court. So I looked at some of the archival material for that. What's quite interesting is that they didn't have big fines or anything like that, or they didn't go to prison, but they relied on public shaming. And so that's basically the protagonists who are caught and tried would effectively have to walk through the streets with a white sheet on them. And this would be very serious, kind of do very serious damage to their reputations.
There's a lot of really interesting points like that where the public and the private sort of clash. And it's really interesting to sort of, trace the back and forth of that conflict over time. You did allude before to the definition of privacy or private life not really being the same for every time period. Can you talk about, that does bring me actually to my question about periodization. You start with the Reformation and Luther, as you've just said. So what was it about the notion of privacy at that point that made that your starting point?
Well, there's one statement that really rang in my head by a 17th century preacher, which was, do nothing privately you wouldn't do publicly. Another in the same period said, privacy is for adulterers and murderers. The idea of privacy then was almost like a frightening thing. People didn't want to be alone. If you're alone, it meant that the devil would come to you. And this was the same for rich or poor. So you could be living in a castle with servants, or you could be living in a shack with your family. you would still be frightened of privacy. So I thought, where did it come from? It can't come from prosperity or wealth. It doesn't come from the buildings itself, you know. It's got to come from a kind of reorganization of society, if you like. And that really does begin with the Reformation and the religious wars. This was a really deeply religious society, very communal. And you were not meant to be on your own because that's when the devil would come to you. So it's changes in religion that begins to carve out, accidentally, strangely, a space for the mind. Because what Luther does, and then what the religious wars do after that, is set up a direct relationship with God. So he pushes away the intermediaries of the Catholic Church, the priests. He basically says, what matters is my relationship with God, which I can kind of develop in relationship to Scripture. After he does that, that does set up a kind of a greater kind of interiority, I think. People are also reading texts in, not in the Latin, they're translated into German and English. And so I think reading kind of frees people to think for themselves. And then you have these tremendous religious wars, particularly in England, actually, where originally there's the Catholic, which is the universal church, then there's the Protestant, then there's more Protestant, then there's Catholic. And so this is a big back and forth between how one is meant to follow their faith, which would have meant people would have been at conflict with the authority of the day. So, for example, if they were Catholic under Henry VIII, he would have asked them to follow him as himself as the supreme leader of the church, and the Protestant faith. And so there would have been this division internally between what their faith was and what they were meant to do. And they were meant to do all sorts of things in these religious times. And so I think that was an accidental split between what people actually thought and what they were meant to say and meant to do. So my argument here is that privacy begins in the mind. The division between public and private begins in the mind. And then a number of other social changes occur in the 18th and 19th century until you get the Victorian periods, and they loved privacy. It was no longer something to be frightened of. It was no longer the case where you had to be the same in public as you were in private. In fact, there was very much an acceptance that you'd be different in private. Privacy was a kind of a national value. And this is both in Britain and in America, where you have this very famous article, The Right to Privacy, by Warren and Brandeis, where these two Bostonian lawyers effectively argue that we all need privacy. The modern self needs privacy, to the extent that they suggest that the newspapers should withhold information about private individuals, even if it was truthful. So a big change.
Yeah. And when there's a really interesting discussion of Thomas More in there, and that was when it really crystallized for me just how different it was in terms of how you related to your faith, because I think wasn't there something that he or someone in that time said about professing one faith with your words and another in your heart, and that just made me immediately go back and think of early Christianity in the first few Roman centuries, where the greatest thing that you could do for your faith was to die for it, where a public declaration of it that would lead to your death. What a far way to come. That's so interesting.
Yeah, Thomas More was a fascinating character. So he's a Catholic. He was very close to Henry VIII, but when Henry VIII created the Protestant Reformation in England, Thomas More couldn't go along with it. He knew that it would be very destabilizing, that effectively the authority of Rome, if it was questioned this way, would no longer hold. And he was actually right. He's the first person to use anarchy in the English language, and he was referring to Luther, and Luther did actually create a form of anarchy. Henry VIII demanded that every citizen, every subject in Britain take an oath, the oath of succession, which basically said, I will follow you, not the Pope. And I recognise your marriage to Anne Boleyn, this is his second wife, that Catholics couldn't countenance. Thomas More wouldn't take that oath. He wouldn't say publicly what he thought to be untrue. And he thought he could probably get away with it. He's a very senior man. He knew Henry very well. He wasn't speaking against the king. He was being silent, effectively. But no, Henry would not allow that to stand. And Thomas More was tried for treason. He does plead, he does speak to his family, who basically say, why don't you just say it? It doesn't matter. Surely God knows what's in your heart, but he can't do it. This is a very religious society, and there was a sense that if you spoke an untruth, you might go to hell. So effectively, in the end, he feared God more than he feared his king, and he was executed for it. His head was chopped off. A very, very menacing message to all the Catholics in the country, many of whom did then take the oath, but not all of them did. And what that effectively did was create a dissident Catholicism, kind of, and you had these networks, really, these secret networks of Catholics. And they all began to think about, well, on what are the circumstances that mean that we can say one thing and think the other in our hearts. They begin to practice what's called kind of casuistry. There are big philosophical discussions about this kind of split. So it effectively countenances a kind of hypocrisy,
Mm.
saying something that you don't believe because in your heart you know God will allow it.
So, as you said before, the peak of the separation of public and private life happens in the Victorian era, and we have sort of been creeping, creeping away from it since then. Can you talk about some of the reasons that you identify that, now today, the notion of the private life is at risk?
Yeah, so we often hear about how um, private life and privacy is threatened because of social media and digital technology. So Facebook, Twitter, whatever your kind of vice might be online, it's seen as a threat. But I I thought this can't really be the case that one technology can change everything. And in fact, throughout the book, you see a number of different privacy panics caused. The panics are caused by technology, but actually there are other changes in society. So it might be the Victorian period. There's a big discussion about instantaneous cameras and Kodakers, because you've suddenly got cameras that can be portable and you can take them anywhere. And there are pictures of people, women in particular being photographed in parks and their images used in newspaper advertising. The wiretapping panics that you have in the same period illustrate that people have anxieties about technology, but they're not always what takes away privacy. And I look at a number of different developments in the early 20th century. One of them is behaviorism, this kind of theory that you have advertisers use or political policy people, this idea that you can influence people by understanding their psychology. That comes in quite early on in the 20th century. And they do try and kind of manipulate people. Engineer consent is what Edward Bernays had it. And I think these ideas do then later impact upon the tech giants, but they're prior to technology. Then you have two other developments. One I would say is a kind of primacy of authenticity. This idea that, unlike Thomas More, you should say what you know to be true. You should be real. And the two cases of that I look at, just to give the abstraction something a little bit more visual or understandable, would be the reality TV programs, although they weren't called that. One of them was called The Family in Britain, and the other was the American Family, The Louds, they're a family based out of San Francisco. And there was a documentary into both families. This is in like 1972, 1973. They then become headline news, and they're picked apart in both countries for being, for not being kind of politically on message or being dysfunctional. Lance Loud is the first openly gay man in a family context on American television, and he is kind of scrutinized by the media in a way that is pretty uncomfortable.
Mm.
But both families justify this, so it's something that they've invited in. And they justify it on the basis of being more real and authentic. Margaret Wilkins, the mother in the British Family, talks about how films and TV programs never show reality, but this is reality. So there's a sense that you should be the same behind closed doors than you are when you go out into the world. The sense that you might have a kind of different way of behaving that you protect from others. If you've got nothing to hide, that sort of idea is very, very pronounced in the 1970s. And this is a time, of course, when people are beginning to be a bit more relaxed about their sexuality, their living arrangements, because those moral strictures are becoming a lot less harsh and restrictive. And the other trend I talk about is this idea of the personal is political. So I look a lot at the position of women in the private sphere. So it's certainly the case that, they have been restricted to the private world, and that has been stultifying and difficult. And privacy can hide abuse. Although I argue for a private life, privacy isn't or does sort of impede scrutiny and accountability. But radical feminists of the 70s start to talk about this idea of the person as political, where effectively they say that if we want kind of the equal rights that we want, and if we want the social change that we want, you can't just affect change in the political and public world. You need to go into the home. You need to look at language, need to look at where, how children are brought up. And effectively, you need to, in the words of Carol Pateman, one feminist, you need to explode the private. So you need to tear down the border between public and private life. These two developments, the kind of the authenticity and the politicizing of the private, happen long before social media and Facebook. And so I'm trying to look really at the deeper changes that mean when the internet does come along, people are already behaving very differently. They already think that they haven't got anything to hide, and that it's perfectly kind of the difference between public and private is indistinguishable.
That's so interesting to me. And, to your point about reality shows earlier, many of those shows have what they call like a confessional booth, right? Like where you where you are taken aside to say something not in the presence of others. And my grad advisor would be so proud of me right now, but that goes back to like Foucault and sort of like the surveillance that can also happen through that sort of relationship.
No, that's exactly right. So I mean, we talk about the idea of the confessional with the priest, that would have implications for the believer, but you wouldn't expect the priest to tell anybody. Today, people confess in public, and you're right. It basically means come and scrutinize me, come and kind of watch every move I make, and you know, we all have something actually not necessarily to hide, but if we're always acting as if we're being watched, then I think we become probably we have no space to kind of grow, if that makes sense. We absolutely need those sort of spaces to hide.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the things that social media does to this blurring of boundaries is that as you've said, you get this performance of authenticity or this performance of intimacy that leads to like we hear so much now about parasocial relationships and like what looks like intimacy but is actually not, and it has like real world connotations and consequences for people.
Well, one of the reasons why I called it Strangers and Intimates was that I really liked the idea in the sort of 18th and 19th century that suddenly there were those two new categories. So the beginnings of sort of the 18th century, you have a kind of a mercantile society where there's merchants coming, you've got a rising bourgeoisie, and you've got people moving to the city. So suddenly there's all these strangers, and people start talking then about how do we interact with people we don't know. This is like a new phenomenon. That's where you have the introduction of the handshake, which was a change from the bowing and the curtsying that everybody had to do. And at the same time, there was really a creation of the idea of the intimate space. This was both a physical thing with corridors and curtains, but also with the development of the novel, you had this kind of beginnings of the idea of emotion being written on the page. And you also had the household being separated from the economy. So it became this secluded space. You had strangers and intimates. And I think now, if you like, we sort of treat strangers like they are intimates. We don't know about you, but there's a lot of social kissing in this country. People sort of talk about their feelings a lot. There's a lot of intimacy out in public. And at the same time, I think we sort of treat, because we're not really making a distinction between the two, and because we're letting everybody in, the surveillance that you talk about, whether it's state or social media or work, the way in which, because people often now work more at home, their professional life is intruding into their intimate life. We almost treat our intimates like strangers. And I think the problem with that is that there's a good reason for kind of in the civic space to treat people like strangers as equals, talk to them kind of professionally and politely, and also intimacy isn't intimacy if everybody can see it. It has to be a kind of dark and secluded space that not everybody has access to for us really to build intimacy with our friends and loved ones.
Absolutely. My gosh, this has been so fascinating. Thank you so much for joining us. I always like to ask at the end, I know that, not all authors can talk about things in process, but are you writing right now or?
I'm really interested in the idea of shame and stigma. Um, I think we can all think of all the examples of where it's been a really negative thing. But I'm interested in how it's also a kind of a bounding, and it sort of communicates what is and isn't permissible. And I just think that's probably as complicated as the rise and fall of private life, but possibly as interesting.
Wow. Yeah, and it seems relevant to that project as well, because I think in many ways Twitter or what have you has recreated that the public shaming ritual. It just happens in the digital sphere now. So
I think that's right. I think that's right. We can see it play out in front of us, and it's a very negative process.
Absolutely. Well, thank you again. This has been really wonderful. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
All right, listeners, it's your turn now. Please check out Strangers and Intimates, The Rise and Fall of Private Life. It's been out in the UK for a bit. By the time that you hear this, it'll be out in the US as well. So please head to your favorite bookstore or library or website, wherever you like to go for books. All right, it is now time to close this chapter. We'll see you next time.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.